Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation Food Safety Modernization Act 101 webinar for agricultural professionals. Thanks for being here with us today. Our speakers, Kaylee Firesile and Dave Runston with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, will review key components of FSMA regulations, as well as link you to resources to find out more about FSMA requirements for organic growers. We wanted to note that today's webinar is supported through a USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Western SARE grant. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't see or can't hear, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan and I will be your host today. I am a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. My colleague Jacob Guth will also be online with us today. Jacob is CCOF's Food Safety Program Manager. Prior to his current role, he worked in CCOF's Organic Certification Department for many years. Jacob will be online to answer organic certification-related questions if they happen to come up, as well as give a brief introduction to third-party food safety audits at the end of the webinar. Before we get started with our first speaker, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items. We are happy to announce that this live webinar broadcast has been approved for Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Units. To receive credit for attending the webinar, include your full name and Certified Crop Advisor certification number in the evaluation form at the end of the webinar. You must attend the entire webinar to receive credit. I also wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts: the viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything on the presenter's screen, and the control panel on the right. Within the control panel is how you can participate in today's event, so let's look at that. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close the control panel. From the View menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to keep it always open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via phone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So we'd like to encourage you to test out the questions pane. Let us know where you're calling in from today and how your work involves organic. And we have a pretty good crowd in the audience today, which is great. And we wanted to let you know we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. We'll also have two other webinars in this series. So if there's questions we can't get to today, there'll be other opportunities to address them in the future. And we'll also have contact information for people to follow up after the webinar. So if we don't get to your question today, there's lots of opportunities to get answers. So thanks again for being with us here today. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Kaylee Firesile serves as CAF's Food Safety Specialist. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to her background in diversified vegetable production, Kaylee recently studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her degree in public health and nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. Also with us today is Dave Runston, who serves as CAF's Policy Director. He directs all of CAF's policy work as well as food safety and water stewardship outreach. Dave is an agricultural economist who conducted research on topics such as contact agriculture in Mexico, fair trade coffee in Oaxaca, and regional competitiveness of the produce industry. So Kaylee and Dave, thank you for being with us here today, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Megan, and to everyone who is on the webinar today for taking the time to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act and the National Organic Program regulations and work through how they intersect and are in alignment and work for both organic growers and growers that have to implement food safety. So Dave and I will go through the presentation here, as Megan stated, and we will start by talking about a little bit of history of foodborne illness outbreaks. And first, we have to acknowledge that this material is from a National Institute of Food and Agriculture grant, and that the opinions, findings, and conclusions are not their view. Okay, logistically, this is webinar 1. We're going to go over how contamination happens on a farm, talk about the produce rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act, what types of produce is covered, and then the different farm categories under the rule, which are fully exempt farms, partially exempt, or as the rule defines them, qualified exempt farms, and then covered farms that are subject to all the requirements. We're also going to talk about the timeline for compliance and enforcement for these different farm types. As you can imagine, that's probably a lot to cover in an hour or so. So we have broken this up into 3 webinars, and today is more of a higher level overview and paints the picture for all the kind of different farms at a higher level, and then we will funnel down into more specifics in webinar 2 and 3, which are listed here of the dates. The official registration is not live yet, but if you received it through the CCOF promotional emails and or through CAF or other means, we will be advertising the same way for these next 2, so you'll be included. And yeah, so these are a 3-part webinar, and then we also later this fall will be releasing 10 fact sheets and an updated farmer's guide resource. And then one other kind of logistical note is that while this presentation is titled for organic professionals, we realize there might be some farmers on the line, and that's great. Thanks for joining us too. The information isn't different whether you're an organic inspector or an organic reviewer or a farmer. It's all the same. It's just that this grant in particular was targeted to organic professionals that work out in the field and interact with growers. So if you're a farmer or you're an organic professional, this will be useful for you, for both of you. So just a brief overview of the goals of this webinar series. We want to help listeners understand food safety metrics, specifically the new Food Safety Modernization Act regulations and how they line up with the National Organic Program regulations. Also help you learn, if you are one of these organic professionals that interact with growers, help you learn about some more resources you can direct growers to if they ask you questions on food safety or FSMA and good agricultural practices. And then lastly, throughout all of this, we want this to be a forum and a 2-way dialogue to have anyone ask questions or pose scenarios that you've encountered and are looking for some clarifying input in on how it all fits together, because this is all very technical and every farm is different. So there's not a lot of, you have to really tease it out what it all means for each farm. Okay, so that's kind of all the logistics and overview of it all. Now to get into the content of the presentation. So on-farm food safety, why is it important? Well, especially organic growers are doing their part and working really hard to be good stewards of the land and the produce that you grow, to have a quality product go to market and go to consumers. You want to make sure that it's safe and that you're not making your customers sick. This can be difficult sometimes because microbes are off, you can't see them, and they may be on some beautiful head of broccoli, and unless you had good food safety practices in place, you might not have any idea. So food safety is important for all farms of all sizes because, as we'll see in the next few slides of examples of foodborne illness outbreaks in the past, growers of all sizes and types have been involved. So it's important to recognize where a particular farm's risks are and implement a right-sized food safety program for your farm, depending upon what state and federal regulations you're subject to, buyer requirements, and the unique circumstances of your farm.
FDA defines three main types of potential contamination of food. Physical contamination, where something, you know, that a worker has or some machine or something, you know, gets into the product. You know, there's plenty of examples, for instance, in some of these leafy green bags where you know, pieces of animals swept up in the field have ended up in the bags and so forth. The second one is chemical contamination, and there have been some examples of that where some sort of pesticide that wasn't approved for a particular crop was sprayed and made people ill, or it could be some other chemical like a lubricant of something from equipment. And the final one is biological or microbial contamination, which is what we're going to talk about today. And this includes a whole range of pathogenic bacteria, things that FDA has defined as adulterants and that are not allowed to be sold on crops. So we're going to give you a few examples of this. Probably the most famous example was back in 2006, which was a very important example because it really led to the whole Food Safety Modernization Act. And at that time, E. coli 0157H7 was found in bagged baby spinach, led to over 200 people becoming ill and 3 people dying. FDA for some time had been telling the industry that they needed to pay more attention to this, and FDA shut down the industry at that point, the spinach industry, and they lost a considerable amount of money from that, and that really prompted action, led to the leafy green marketing agreement in California and Arizona, for example. Another example are outbreaks linked to water. Down in the south, there was problems. People were irrigating from ponds. This surface water was found to be contaminated with salmonella. Was being used in tomatoes, and they finally figured that out and stopped doing that. And some other examples were from water used in Guatemala, in backpack sprayers on raspberries. The water was contaminated with cyclospora and ended up making people sick. Another would be in Canadian spinach, Shigella, associated with septic tanks leaking and contaminating surface water that was being used in the crop. So water is a big concern. And we're not going to get to an extensive discussion of water until the third of these webinars because FDA is in the process of revising the water standard in FSMA. Then, of course, you know, there are things related to workers. For instance, the green onions, which these women were sitting in the edge of the fields and putting rubber bands around the green onions and contaminated them, both with Shigella and then again with hepatitis A. Both of these were coming from the workers. California strawberries also had an example of a hepatitis A outbreak. just to give you an example of how worker health can be an extremely important part of this. And we're going to get to health and hygiene in the second webinar. And then we have animal access to the fields. The Food Safety Modernization Act basically does not require you to fence your fields, does not require you to exclude all animals from them and so forth, but it does require you to not harvest produce that has been contaminated by feces from animals or birds. And so one example was in Oregon back in 2011, and it was a strawberry farm. They had a U-pick place on the farm. People came, harvested strawberries, took them to farm stands and farmers markets, sold them, and made a group of people ill. And it was basically traced to this deer that were entering. And this wasn't the first time that deer were found to be a source of E. coli 0157H7 in Oregon. This had happened before. Now in California, we've never found deer to be carriers of E. coli 0157H7, but that's not to say it's not possible. And finally, I think this is the final one. Here we have an example of equipment contamination. And this was the Jensen brothers in Colorado. They were shipping cantaloupes there. Many people died. And the general belief is that they were never able to clean the machine that they were using. They'd bought a used potato washer, and since potatoes are never eaten raw, it was never going to make people sick, but using it for cantaloupes, it wasn't really possible to clean the machine possibly. And so they got listeria in there, and listeria is easy to get in any kind of operation of food processing. And the farmers would actually face criminal charges. It was the first time the government ever brought criminal charges against a farm for food safety violation. And they pleaded guilty to this, had 5 years probation. So that's a cautionary tale. It's possible that you could be convicted. Oh, we have one more. E. coli again, 0157H7, with dairy lagoon water, and then this, what I mentioned before, the use of a banned pesticide, insecticide on watermelons back in 1985, made many people sick and killed 6 people. So there's many different ways that people can be made ill from produce, and so that's the basis of trying to prevent this from happening through the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Great, Dave, thank you. So now we wanted to take a moment. That was a lot of examples and scenarios that were explained, and give a chance if there were questions from the audience for those to be typed in.
Yeah, so feel free to type in your questions. And we also just wanted to loop back around to the questions that we asked at the beginning of the webinar as to where people were calling in from and how their work involves organic. And we have people calling in from Salinas, Oregon, Watsonville, Iowa. We also have some inspectors on the line and other types of organic professionals. So thanks for all being with us here today. And a question came in asking, is there a rule to verify the water? And I'm not sure if that's in terms of food safety or kind of what that means, but if you want to kind of. Thanks,
Megan. Yeah, there is a specific section of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we'll probably just say as FSMA, referred to as FSMA the rest of this, so it's a little bit less of a mouthful. There is a section of FSMA that talks about production water and then post-harvest water. And as Dave mentioned, we're going to dive deep into this during the 3rd webinar because there's still some unannounced details that the FDA is announcing later, hopefully sometime this fall. So once we know what that information is and that content is, then we'll circle back on it.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks.
There definitely is. There are requirements for testing your water and actions that you have to take depending on what you find. But that process is being revised as we speak. I see the FDA just came out today to say that you could use different tests than they had originally proposed. So we'll get that all figured out, and that'll be in the third webinar.
Great, thanks. And then someone also wrote in asking about if there has been reports of cottontail rabbits having E. coli. As you had mentioned deer, she was wondering about cottontail rabbits.
I don't know about that particular species off the top of my head, but
there's been research done here at the university and also by Andy Gordis, of Fish and Wildlife. We'd have to look back and see. There's some incidents in lots of different animals and birds. It's usually pretty low, but that's something that we can figure out. And when we get around to talking about animals in the third webinar, we'll be sure to talk about that.
Great, thanks. And then kind of looping back around to the water, is there a microbiological test that they're requiring? And it sounds like that's going to be addressed in the third webinar.
Yes, but we can say as it currently stands, FSMA requires farms to test for generic E. coli, and generic E. coli is used as the indicator for pathogens in water. And there's a certain number of times that you need to test your water depending upon where you're getting it from and how you're using it. I don't think it's the best use of our time to dive into that right now since it might all change, but you can follow up with Dave or I or Jacob after the webinar. If you are a person that has really specific questions about this, we can explain it in more detail and direct you to resources that explain how it currently stands.
Great, thanks a lot. So I think we're going to move on to the next portion of the presentation, but if you have questions that come up during the presentation, just send them in, and there's a couple other times that we're going to stop for questions, so we'll get to those later in the presentation.
Okay, great. So we just went over kind of how we got to FSMA, and now we're going to go over the three main categories of farms under FSMA. So there's a lot of different terms within FSMA. Covered produce refers to crops that FSMA regulates, and this isn't what you might think of crops that are physically covered by a row cover or greenhouse or something like that. These are crops that the law covers. A farm that is subject to the law, or a covered farm, is a farm that needs to meet certain criteria that we'll go into in detail. A qualified exempt farm, you can think of that as AKA a partially exempt farm. So you will have to do a reduced number of regulations and steps to be in compliance. And then a qualified end user has to do with the qualified exempt farm, and that's essentially having direct sales to consumers or restaurants within 275 miles from the farm or the same state or Indian reservation that the farm is located in. So that's a brief overview. Those are there up front, but we're going to talk more about them as we go here. So the history is that in 2011, President Obama signed FSMA into law after the 2006 spinach outbreak and everything that happened after that. That led to FSMA. And then in November 2015, the FDA started implementing the law. So just to give you a higher level overview, FSMA has 7 main rules, and those apply to different parts of the supply chain. So this isn't just something that affects produce farmers. This also affects aggregators and distributors and people transporting product, importers of product from other countries. So this goes all throughout the supply chain. This is just unique for produce farms because it's the first time there's a sweeping federal regulation that applies for food safety requirements for on-farm. So right now we're nearing the end of this regulation implementation phase of education and outreach and awareness, and it's not really the end. It's going to continue past 2018, but we're really been working on getting the word out to growers, and it's great that you all are on the line because this is just all what this is about right now. And then starting in January 2018, states will start enforcing the law on the biggest farms. And then we have this asterisk here that farms have an extra 2 years to meet the water regulations, and that might extend and be different from that even. We'll talk more about the timelines coming up. Okay, so an important part about all of the produce rule is that very few parts of it are prescriptive. So this can be frustrating for growers initially because they just want to be told how to be in compliance. Tell me the 3 steps for everything I need to do to be done with this. But really, there's very few prescriptive details. The law is a preventative approach. It involves critical thinking and assessing your unique situation and how you can reduce risk on a farm, which you're never going to have a farm be a zero risk environment. It's all about reducing it down as much as possible. An example of how the law is not prescriptive are this part 112, 128 that I pulled from the regulation. What requirements apply regarding pest control in buildings? You must take those measures reasonably necessary to protect covered produce, food contact surfaces, and food packaging materials from contamination by pests in buildings, including routine monitoring for pests as necessary and appropriate. A lot of people are probably wondering, what does reasonably necessary mean? What is monitoring for pests that is necessary and appropriate? That's all risk dependent on a farm and the circumstances they're under, and we also will continue to get guidance documents released by FDA on different topics within the law that will help provide some clarification on these different details as well.
Let me interject here that we asked for this. We were afraid that if everything was simply dictated, that one size wouldn't fit all, that it would end up being dictated for larger farms, and that a lot of smaller diversified farms would have a very difficult time complying. So we're actually quite glad that the FDA took this approach, which is a risk-based approach and basically allows the farm to customize these regulations. Not everything, some of the stuff is prescriptive, but a lot of it allows you to figure out what kind of food safety practices you should implement.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so the 3 categories. First, we're going to start with fully exempt farms. So how is a farm fully exempt? A farm is fully exempt if you grow produce that is only for personal or on-farm consumption, if you grow produce that is on the FDA's rarely consumed as raw list, if you grow produce that goes through a kill step, for example, tomatoes that go and are processed into tomato sauce, or grapes that are fermented into wine, examples like that. Or if you don't fit any of those initial categories, you could still be fully exempt if you have $25,000 or less in annual produce sales from your farm. So $25,000 is not a set target. It's actually a moving target that we'll talk more about in a minute. But first, let's think about and review what the list of produce rarely consumed as raw is. This is the entire list that the FDA has provided, and it's important for growers to look at this list because some crops that a grower might think are rarely consumed as raw might not be on here, but some that they wouldn't think would be on here are. So it's just important that if a farm is growing collards and kale and chard, the collards are on this list of rarely consumed as raw, but the kale and the chard aren't. There's some crops that might seem really similar, but if a farm was only growing all collards, no matter how many dollars they sold in them each year, they would be fully exempt from the law because they're only growing collards that are on this list of rarely consumed as raw crops. A lot of diversified operations are not going to fit into this because if you have just one of the crops that is grown on the farm that's not on this list, then it doesn't matter. You're not a fully exempt farm. You have to have all your crops be on here, then you could be fully exempt. Okay, and so back to the $25,000 threshold. As we mentioned earlier, the law was passed in 2011. So the monetary values for different thresholds of farm types are set into 2011 dollars. And I think I'll let Dave talk a little bit more about this since he's got an economic background.
Yeah, so these are like constant 2011 dollars. So basically, we're going to account for inflation every year. And so that it doesn't lose value, right? Because the price of everything goes up, even if it just goes up a little bit, as it has been in recent years, it nevertheless goes up. So what was 25,000 in 2011 was almost 27,000 in 2016, and in 2017 it'll be even higher. And the way this rule is set up, it's like you average the last 3 years of your sales, and in the case of 25,000, we're averaging produce sales. You'll see in a minute that that's not true for the other cutoffs. But so you would average these sales, and you would average these numbers here that are inflated, and then you would compare the two averages to see if you're fully exempt. Don't we have more on this, or no, we come back to it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So basically you need to be able to prove that your farm is fully exempt from FSMA if somebody comes and asks for the records. In California, this will be done by CDFA, the Department of Food and Agriculture, which will be under contract to FDA to inspect farms for compliance with FSMA. And so, you know, you will need, like if you were saying, well, I don't grow anything except stuff that's rarely consumed raw or things that are processed, you know, then you would have to have some records to show that. So for instance, you would need to get some kind of letter from the processor saying that they, you know, had bought your crop and were processing it in a way that killed these pathogens. So that will become a common thing that goes on. People need to document this stuff so that if somebody comes to inspect, you can prove that you have an exemption. And the same would be, you know, less than $25,000 in sales.
Okay, so that was fully exempt farm criteria, and we're going to circle back to this with some examples. So if it's all not totally clear to you, we're going to keep fleshing this out. The second category of farms are qualified exempt farms. These farms are farms that meet, there we go, that have two conditions for this partial exemption from FSMA requirements. The first is that you have to have less than $500,000 in annual gross sales of all products from the farm. So this is important because unlike the $25,000 cutoff, the $25,000 cutoff is for produce only. The $500,000 cutoff is all farm sales. So if you're a dairy, you have to include the dairy sales if that's under the same business entity as your farm stand produce sales, for example. So you have to be under this monetary threshold, and you have to sell at least 50.1% of your sales directly to customers, or what the law refers to as qualified end users. So examples of a qualified end user are customers at a farmer's market, or sales through a CSA, a community supported agriculture program, or at a farm stand or to a restaurant. These must be within the same state or less than 275 miles from the farm or on the same Indian reservation. So this is really important, and that "and" box is squared off for a reason, because you have to meet both of these criteria. You can't have one or the other. You must meet both, and we'll explain how you need to have documentation to prove that you will meet both. So again, this $500,000 threshold is in 2011 dollars. So this is a bigger jump here because we're talking about more money. And farms that have about $500,000 in gross sales, you might be under this threshold in this 2014 to 2016 average. So it's not just if you hear it referred to as a straight $500,000 threshold cutoff, it's not quite that. It's actually a moving target. So these tables are on these FDA links that we have on both of these slides, so you can check them on their website, and especially in the future in 2017 and onward when the new values are added moving forward. Okay, so maybe you're sitting here, and if you're a farmer and you realize that you think your farm is qualified exempt, what do I need to do? So the first thing you need to do is to keep records to prove you're exempt. And you need to prove that you have less than $500,000 in 2011 dollars of sales. So you need to have sales receipts or invoices or tax records, some sort of financial record. These records can be written or electronic, and they need to be signed or initialed by a record keeper. And you can store them off-site if that's necessary, but realize that in California or in other states, if the FDA is the inspector, you would have 24 hours to have the records available to an inspector asking you about FSMA. Importantly, the law mentioned that you needed to start keeping these records in March of 2016. So if a farm is learning about this for the first time right now, hopefully they can go back and curate these records together, and they'd have access to most of them anyways, and get them all organized and in one place and ready to go moving forward. The second thing you need to do if you're a qualified exempt farm is you need to have the full business name and address of where the food was grown at the point of sale. So if you sell your broccoli and other crops through a CSA box, that box needs to have your farm name and the farm business address, whether or not that's the physical address or the PO box address on the box for the customer. If you drop off boxes at a local grocery store and they turn around and put it out on the shelves right at that grocery store, you would fulfill this by having your name and address on the box that goes to the store. You don't need to have the store post your name and full address for the customer to see. It just needs to be for the store. And other examples that we have listed there. The third thing you need to do is to have a record that you have annually reviewed your FSMA status and that you have verified that your farm is still a qualified exempt farm. So this would be, annually going through and checking your financials, that you're under the 500,000 and that you're selling at least the majority of your sales to a qualified end user. And then lastly, just because your farm is a qualified exempt farm, that doesn't mean that you will be that way forever. You still need to comply with these record keeping requirements, and if your farm is involved in a foodborne illness outbreak, the FDA may revoke your qualified exempt status, and that could be possible. You need to realize that. So for all farms, no matter what your FSMA status is, you are prohibited from putting contaminated food into commerce. This is often referred to as adulterated food. So that's just important to know, that every farm needs to make sure they're not putting contaminated food into the marketplace.
Yeah, so these pathogenic bacteria that we were talking about earlier, those are all considered adulterants by the FDA. So if something from your farm ends up in a grocery store with something like that on it, then you put contaminated food into commerce. And the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which has been around quite a long time, prohibits that. Okay, and so then for the qualified exemption,
your timeline for this is slightly later than 2018. If you have between $250,000 and $499,999 in sales, you would have until January 2019 to have the 3 different records and business and farm name posted, all of that what we just talked about. And if you're in the lower tier, you have until 2020. But really, these are pretty simple tasks to do, and you know, having your farm name where your produce is important for marketing and other business practices. So these should be something that qualified exempt farms are able to put in place. Okay, so I'll let Dave talk about some California direct marketing laws.
Yeah, so in California, we do have laws that have been passed in recent years on direct marketing, and each of these laws include an obligation on the part of the farmers to implement good agricultural practices on their farms. So there was a CSA law that was passed in 2013, there was a revised farmers market law passed in 2014, and the rules for that are about to come out any day now. And then there was the urban garden law, that is everything that's not on land zoned for agriculture in California. This law, AB 1990, was passed to allow these people to sell produce, but in each case, there's an obligation to implement gaps. We don't know whether CDFA is going to, you know, enforce this or not. That discussion hasn't occurred. It's conceivable that as they go around and inspect farms, if they discover that somebody has an exemption or a qualified exemption and are selling obviously directly to the public, they may want to see that people have actually implemented food safety practices on the farm. That was the idea of this, was that every farm growing produce would implement food safety practices appropriate to the farm, even the very smallest farms. Of course, you know, the buyers may still demand, you know, some sort of third-party audit or a food safety plan or some proof of this. There's a possibility going forward that you may not be able to get insurance if you don't have this. And so we have always encouraged every farm to develop a food safety plan. Did I skip one? And so, oh, yeah, so anyway, that was just a form, whoops. That was just a form that you fill out if you're applying for a CSA status in the state. The same thing when you go get a CPC from the county ag commissioner, right? You sign your name and there's this line there that says, I'm knowledgeable and intend to produce in accordance with good agricultural practices as published by the department. Now, CDFA has put some model gaps on their website and direct marketing website, but you're not required to follow those. That's just guidance. So, but you are required to implement gaps on your farm.
So what are gaps? And I just want to also say here that while this focus of this webinar series is FSMA and the federal policies, we're bringing in a little bit of state level in California, and there may be some other state level specific laws in other parts of the country, just to kind of paint the overall picture of a farm has to figure out what FSMA means for them, what state level laws mean for them, and what buyers are requiring. So what are gaps? Gaps are good agricultural practices, and they fall into 5 main areas of focus: water, employee training, land use and animal access, equipment, tools and buildings, manure, compost, and chemicals. So as we mentioned earlier, with the different examples of foodborne illness outbreaks linked to various of these, all of these focus areas, these are the main areas where a farm can understand their practices in these areas, and then where the risks are and how to reduce them. So this is just the fundamental food safety kind of outline and approach that all farms should take, no matter what regulation says for them. Okay, and now we're going to review what the last category of FSMA farms are, which is fully subject farms. So based off of what we talked about already, a farm would be a fully subject farm if their 3-year adjusted average gross sales is greater than $500,000 in 2011 adjusted dollars, and or if they sell less than $500,000 in adjusted average gross sales, but they do not sell at least half of the majority of their sales to a qualified end user. So some examples for this are, you know, maybe a small strawberry grower sells 50,000 in strawberries every year, but sells them to a local packing house, and they go out onto the wholesale market. So that would be a farm that doesn't meet the second criteria of selling at least 50.1% of their sales to a qualified end user. We'll go through some more scenarios. But if a farm is fully subject, slide's having some trouble advancing.
We're on the covered farm requirements right now.
Okay, I see that. Thanks. So a covered farm, this is a brief overview of it, but you would need to have at least one supervisor or responsible person complete an FDA-approved training, and right now there's one FDA-approved training offered through the Produce Safety Alliance, or the PSA. So you would have at least one person from the farm go to this 8-hour course and then learn all about the different areas of risk that you can reduce, and you get a big binder that has all of the slides that are gone over during that presentation. And you get a certificate that you would keep on file if you were ever, you know, inspected. You would want to make sure you had that for inspectors. Excuse me. And CAF will be offering these PSA trainings later in 2017 and onward, and there's lots of other groups that are offering them as well. I believe on our resources page at the end, we have the link to the Produce Safety Alliance, where you can go to their upcoming grower training list, and you can see all of these grower trainings offered throughout the country and all the upcoming ones. Okay, so there's that main training requirement of the PSA training for covered farms, and then also FSMA has specific requirements in record keeping, for worker health and hygiene, for natural resources, for your inputs on your farm, for water, and for harvest and post-harvest. We're not going to dive into those today. We're going to go over those in the second and third webinar. But the bottom line is that this is a process, especially for a farm that's new to food safety. So I encourage all growers on the line and people who professionals that interact with growers that are new to FSMA and food safety to tell them to get started, and really you got to make a lot of small changes to have those add up and make your big changes that you need to have done. So there's requirements in the law, and then there's some recommendations. The law does not require a farm to have a farm food safety plan, but as Dave mentioned, and I know Jacob at CCOF agrees too, that all farms should have a food safety plan, no matter what your size and regulations say for you. It just helps keep everything organized, and a food safety plan is scale appropriate to a farm too. A small half-acre farm is probably not going to have a 100-page food safety plan. It's just going to go over what's applicable for that farm. We have some templates for for food safety plan, different parts of it in English and Spanish on our website, and there's lots of other organizations and resources out there for this. And then secondly, FSMA does not require a third-party food safety audit. However, that's for the grower level, for the produce rule. For a different part of the rule called the preventative controls rule, which is what distributors and facilities have to abide by, and buyers, they have to meet something called the supplier verification. And there's a number of ways they can do that. They could go visit their farms, they could get written documentation, they could look at their food safety plan. One other way is that they ask farms to provide a third-party food safety audit. So That's kind of an area of confusion, and we can talk more about that if people would like. Okay, so we're getting into the intersection of FSMA and organic certification, and really there's a lot of overlap for a farm that's an established organic farm that's used to keeping the required paperwork and their organic system plan for their organic certification. And importantly, FSMA does not require you to do anything that would contradict the NOP program standards. There are some areas where an organic farm that's never done anything for food safety will have to make some significant changes, and that's in their worker health and hygiene and in their production and post-harvest water areas of the farm. And like we said, we're going to go more into these in the future. So the timeline for fully subject farms that have to do everything that the law says, the biggest farms that sell over 500,000 will be starting this January 2018, but the water will be at least until 2020, if not later. And you can see the breakdown of 2019 and 2020 for the different levels of sales. Okay, so we've been talking a lot. That was a lot of information, but Megan, I don't know if you have any questions you want to relay to us, or if we should keep going.
Yeah, we've had a number of questions come in, so we'll get to those. And also, just for the audience, if you'd like to write in and let us know kind of what FSMA category you think a lot of the growers you work with fall into, that would be great too. We'd love to kind of hear who's in the audience. So one question that came in is whether there is an interagency document, FDA, USDA, National Organic Program for food safety and organic certification. So kind of like this cross-departmental document. And Jacob, feel free to jump in if you like on this question too.
Yeah, I don't think, there's not a document that I know of that's like an official interagency NOP FDA document. I know that the heads of these agencies and their staff work closely together to make sure that there's some coordination, but in terms of NOP and FDA, not at this time.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
And then we also got a couple questions coming in about the qualified exemption, and one of them was just to clarify that, or asking whether it's based on sales and not the crops you produce.
Right, so if you are producing crops that are on the FDA's rarely consumed as raw list, and your crops are only on that list, then it defaults to the crops you're growing, because you could grow $1 million worth of collards and be fully exempt from the law because the collards are on the rarely consumed as raw list. However, if you grow $100,000 worth of collards and $100,000 worth of broccoli, now all of a sudden you have a crop that's not on the raw list, so you have to look at the total dollar sales. So you'd have $200,000 in sales, and then you'd have to say, okay, I'm over the $25,000 fully exempt threshold. Now I'm under the $500,000 qualified exempt, but do I sell the majority of these $200,000 worth of crops to the qualified end user? So it's not, unfortunately, a blanket statement of it's always the financial amount or it's only the type of crop. You kind of have to look at how I just kind of illustrated it in that example.
Okay, thanks. So it sounds like it's something that you really kind of have to look at what you're producing and how that fits into the FSMA rules to figure out where your compliance is.
Correct.
Okay, good. And then we had another question related to the qualified exemption, just asking kind of where that $500,000 mark came from. Like, why did they choose that number instead of another number?
It was just a politically negotiated number. I think we proposed $1 million, but the consumer groups thought that was too high and opposed that, and so 500,000 was a compromise. The 25,000 was also a compromise. The consumer groups were concerned that small growers in developing countries like China or someplace would escape regulation if we set that number too high. So 25,000 was a political compromise.
Great, thank you. And then we had a question come in that says that organic farms already keep extensive records. FSMA will require new sets of records, and they do not overlap. Is CAF working on organic record keeping sheets for organic farms to help them keep two sets of records?
Yeah, there's a few different things in that question. So the first that I want to make sure is mentioned is that if you're already keeping a record for your organic system plan that would fulfill what you need to do for food safety, you don't need to have duplicate records. You could just pull that record from your OSP plan for a CDFA inspector and say, here, look, this is my input log where all my soil amendments are recorded and where they go when and what field and when the first harvest is on that field, etc. If you have the information on it that you need for food safety, don't have to have two separate documents. The second part of that is about if CAF is working on organic specific record keeping templates. Not exactly that, but we're working on fact sheets, and one of them goes into the specific requirements that you need to, the records you need to keep track of, and there's example forms on that fact sheet that'll come out later this fall. But we'll take note of that, and I don't know, Jacob, if you have anything on CCOF's end or others about that.
Well, I think there's ample templates out there for organic systems, and like you had said, Kaylee, that if they overlap with a FSMA requirement, like let's consider traceability and your ability to trace your product one step forward and one step back. That's something that's a record you keep for your organic system plan. Well, that dovetails and overlaps nicely with the FSMA requirement for traceability. Same with application records. So you would just keep one set of records for those overlapping requirements. And then where FSMA requires new records to be kept, then there's also templates being created by, you guys, some by us, on-farm family. There's a lot of resources out there for people to access these new templates for food safety specific requirements. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And yeah, we will send links out to resources so that everybody has access to those after the webinar. So I think we're going to move on to the next part of the presentation. But again, if you have more questions, so we have a couple other question breaks, so we'll get to them later in the presentation.
Great, thank you, Megan. So now we're just going to go through a couple examples, and this is going to be a little bit of switching back and forth between Dave and I talking, and then Megan using the poll function of the webinar so we can get some interactive time with everyone. On this slide, I apologize, there's a lot of words, but that's because the whole left-hand side of the slide is a little cheat sheet to help you remember the different criteria needed for fully exempt farms or qualified exempt farms. So we're going to go over 4 scenarios here of different types of farms, and then after each one, a poll is going to pop up, and you are going to select if that farm is fully exempt, qualified exempt, or fully subject to the law. So scenario 1, Joe's farm has $200,000 of total gross sales annually and sells $150,000 of those sales through a CSA and farmers markets.
So just take a little time to look at that, and then we'll launch the poll. So what category do you think Joe's farm falls into? And so if you just want to go in and click on your screen and send in your answers, we'll take a couple seconds just to give people time to vote, or I guess select their answer. It's not exactly voting. So, all right, I think we got a good number of answers, so we're going to close the poll. And you can see what what the answers are there.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your participation. And the 73% of you that said qualified exempt are right on there in that this farm is meeting the qualified exempt because they have under the $500,000 of food sales, and they sell at least half, or the majority, I'm sorry, the majority of their sales, which is over $101,001 to a qualified end user, which is the CSA and farmers market. Okay, so scenario number 2. Tara's farm has $100,000 gross annual sales, and $80,000 is made by selling strawberries and tomatoes to a distributor. The other $20,000 is from farm stand sales of strawberries and other vegetables. How about this scenario? Take a moment.
So again, just think about your answer, and we'll launch the poll in a couple of seconds. I know they get a little more complicated as we go on. So again, go ahead and send in your answer.
You can't see the question when the poll comes up.
We'll take a couple more seconds and then close the poll. So I think we're good. And here you go.
Okay, good. So this one's a little trickier, and excuse me. So 100,000 is significantly below the $500,000 threshold. So Tara's farm meets criteria number 1, but criteria number 2 is at least 50.1% of the sales to a qualified end user, and selling 80,000 to a distributor does not meet that. So Tara's farm would be fully subject to all of FSMA, as half of you selected. So the monetary thresholds can be really confusing because you really have to know where the product is going, and this is probably going to be a little eye-opening for some smaller farms that sell to distributors, because they're going to be subject to all of the requirements that bigger farms have to abide by, and that's just the way the law is written. Okay, so let's move on to scenario number 3. This is a farm, Jenna's farm, which has a large CSA with $600,000 in annual gross sales. Oh, sorry, there's $600,000 in annual gross sales, with $580 of that from the CSA, and then the other $20K is from sales to restaurants. So what do you guys think for FSMA farm category?
Again, so kind of look at that. You have more variables to add, and let us know what you think Jenna's farm falls into. All right, we'll take a couple more seconds. I know this is kind of fast, but all right. So it looks like we're good. I'm going to close the poll.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as 68% of you said, this is a fully covered farm. So here is a scenario where bigger direct market farms that are selling through the different direct market methods are going to be fully subject to all of FSMA, and they may not have been required to do anything for food safety until now. So this is a type of farm that might be really surprised and unaware of different food safety details, and now be fully subject to all of FSMA because they are over the $500,000 threshold. So even though they're selling all 100% of their sales to a qualified end user, that doesn't matter. They're over the $500,000 threshold. Okay, so the last one here is that Debbie's farm has a little bit of a different diversified revenue stream here with $555,000 and $250 from dairy and $250 from grain and $50 from value-added products. We'll say those were cheese, and then $5,000 from a farm stand selling strawberries. So
give them a minute to look at this before you go to the poll, so they can think about it.
This is the extra bonus point scenario. All right, so we're gonna launch the poll and let us know what you think. Give everybody a little time to vote or send in their answers.
Let me talk about this one. This is something we worked on a lot and couldn't solve.
All right. So I think we're good. We're going to close the poll on our super difficult question.
Well, the 46% got that right. Even though they're only selling a small amount of produce that's covered by FSMA, they're nevertheless over the limit, over the $500,000 limit for gross sales from the farm. And so that makes them subject to FSMA and into all the ins and outs of it. Now, we tried to figure out a way to fix this, right? How could a dairy farm, for instance, that sells a lot of milk, and then the child of the farmer wants to start a little produce business and have a farm stand, you know, it's like, why should this be subject to the whole FSMA rule? But we weren't able to find a way out of it. I imagine the only way out of it would be if you started a separate farm to grow the strawberries or something. But as it stands, if it's all part of the same farm, doesn't matter what they're growing. They can be growing animal feed. It's still, if they're over the 500,000 limit, and remember, we're not talking about $2011 in every one of these examples, but that would apply because the money changes over time. But if you're over that cutoff, you're fully subject to FSMA, no matter what you're growing. If you're growing some crop that is subject to FSMA.
okay, so we're gonna try and summarize this right now. How does all of this fit together? And this is gonna be centered around farms in California, but this applies elsewhere as well. So farms in California, as we mentioned, all farms must implement gaps on the farm. That's just part of our direct market laws here, and what various organizations and agencies recommend. And then of that group of farms, so say, you know, in a different state, all the farms in Minnesota, say some of the farms in Minnesota are going to be fully exempt farms, and some of the farms are going to be qualified exempt farms under FSMA, and some of them are going to be fully covered farms. And these sections are not to scale necessarily. And then after FSMA, some farms are going to be required to get a third-party audit by buyers, or maybe they want to do it just internally, or they're self-driven to do it. And then all these different types of FSMA category of farms are also involved in organic regulations, because farms of all sizes are organic. So that is also overlaid over this. And then if farms are doing any value-added products, there's all sorts of different state and federal laws for those farms doing that practice as well. So just trying to create a little visual of how this all fits together, and build on this in our second and third webinar as we get more specific into the details between NOP and FSMA. Again, we'll have our second webinar in November, which will talk about certain obligations of fully covered farms. We're going to divide up, as we talked about. There's a number of different categories for fully covered farms. You know, compost and manure use, and worker health and hygiene, worker training, water. So we're going to surface. So we're going to cover different topics in November, and then we're going to cover water and manure later in January, when hopefully there's a little bit more clarity on specifics on that front. So we'll pause there if there's any other questions before I believe we'll move on to Jacob's presentation.
Yes, that's correct. And we have had a couple other questions come in. We also had some people write in saying that most of the growers they work with are in the certified exempt category.
Sorry, Megan, you mean qualified exempt?
Yes, sorry. Apologies for that. So we had someone write in that says, if a farm is a brand that also sells items that are private labeled from other manufacturers, do they count towards the 3 years of sales? For example, a jam that is not from produce on the farm, or that may be made by the farm company, but now has a label on it that names the farm brand.
Well, the farm is a business. If on your tax return these sales count as sales from your business, then that's gross sales from the farm. So it's really a question of how the business is structured and you know, which things count for what. But we're talking about the farm as a business and the gross sales from that business.
So if that operation is, I'm not sure I caught every detail of that, but if, say, they take ownership of that jam, they pay whoever for it, and then they resell it and they own it, then that would be sales under their business.
Great, thanks. And then we had a couple questions come in regarding more trainings for service providers, as well as are there going to be similar webinars on the preventative controls rules?
Well, on the preventative controls rule, if people are asking specifically between the intersection of the preventative controls rule and organic regulations, such as like organic handlers regulations and things like that, CAF currently doesn't have that on the docket planned. I don't know, Jacob, if there's anything at CCOF.
Not so much yet. We're working on the produce rule trainings that we're going to roll out in 2018, and then I think we'll start to look at preventative controls and how we can educate people.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good idea for the future.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think, Kayla, you're going to do a preventive controls training, aren't you?
I'm going to.
You're going to?
Yeah.
Pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Kaylee will be a resource to ask questions about preventive controls. Also, there's some people at the university at Davis that are resources, and we can refer people to them, Erin and some other people.
Yeah, Erin DiCaprio, she works as a UC Extension agent on small farm processing, and she's an expert in the preventative controls rule and small farm settings, processing settings. So there's a training for that at UC Davis next week, actually. There might still be availability. It's called the PCQI training. And then to get back to the earlier question about more trainings, I don't know if that was referring to specifically preventative controls trainings or if it was referring to FSMA and on-farm produce food safety. There will be lots of trainings of all different types this fall and winter. That's generally the main farmer training time and organic professional training time at different conferences, at the California Small Farmers Conference, at EcoFarm, at various locations across the U.S., given by departments of agriculture and different nonprofit organizations and organizations such as CCOF and others that provide training. So we can make sure to include those links in the resources.
Yeah, definitely. We'll link people to the upcoming trainings. And as you can see on the screen now, there's a good list of resources that CAF has provided. We had another question that just kind of wanted a clarification to say that it's correct to say that a farm that is selling $300,000 in collards and $10,000 in kale to a 51% direct-to-consumer market are qualified exempt, but if they're selling $300,000 of collards and $202,000 of kale to a direct-to-consumer market, if the 51%, they're fully covered. That's kind of a lot of numbers there, but
yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Essentially, the first one was under the $500,000 threshold, and the second one was over the $500,000. But you just have to make sure. We don't want to be too nitpicky, but it's important to look at your 2011 adjusted dollars and make sure you're comparing the right numbers.
That's great. Thanks. And so one more question before we move on to Jacob is there was a grape grower that wrote in that wanted to touch base again as to whether people selling to the wine industry need to comply with FSMA or not.
No, they don't. But they need a letter from the winery saying that their grapes are being processed into wine, right? Because you could sell grapes on fresh market somehow. So you need some evidence that the grapes have actually gone to a winery and been processed.
So yeah, there would be some written document that said that winery X is using industry adopted practices of fermentation and XYZ to process the raw grapes into wine.
Okay, great, thanks. And then we have one more final question, wondering what's the FDA definition of a CSA? So are growers who sell to larger produce box organizations like Farm Fresh to You or online produce box style retailers still considered CSA sales?
It's a gray area.
That's a great question. So this kind of falls into the gray area of food hub, sales through a food hub as well, because it depends in the food hub example on if a food hub is being more of a broker and just helping the transaction happen, or are they taking ownership of the product and then reselling it. I think if this particular person wants to email me or call me, I'm happy to talk more in depth about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's some rules that were created about the ownership of the thing, if the farmers actually own it versus not. But, you know, it's never been completely defined by FDA. We've requested guidance on this, and I don't think that there's ever been any guidance actually finalized on at what point does a, you know, food hub or a box scheme or whatever qualify essentially as a group CSA. A group CSA would be just like a regular CSA in some sense. But anyway, there's no obvious answer to this.
There has been clearly stated that if a farm is having direct internet sales of, you say they're selling flats of strawberries online or something, and then that is allowed, you know, internet sales is considered sales to a qualified end user if the farm is doing it with their own product. When there's another step in that process between selling it to a different farm for them to sell online, we are hoping for some more clarity on.
Great, thanks. So Dave and Kaylee, thank you. That was a really great overview of FSMA and a lot of, you know, making clear the endless moving parts. So thanks a lot for that. And We'll loop back around with you for questions after Jacob's presentation, but we're going to move on. And Jacob, you're welcome to take the lead.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks, Kaylee and Dave, especially for going into the qualified exemptions and the kind of the weeds about how who complies with FSMA. Since FSMA's rolled out and the produce safety rule's been finalized, I feel like that's some of the most complex questions I get is whether or not a farm needs to comply. Okay, well, my name is Jacob Goose. I've been here at CCOF since 2007. I started off as a file reviewer and certification specialist in our grower department. It's now called the farm department. Shortly after I arrived, I was assigned to the food safety beat, I guess you can call it, and was required to monitor food safety metrics that were being created in response to the 2006 E. coli spinach outbreak here on the Central Coast. I slowly started to integrate, doing farm inspections to get me out of the office, and now I currently manage CCOF's Global Gap Food Safety Program. But yeah, I'm basically just here this afternoon. I wanted to provide some perspective on how audits, and specifically third-party audits, play a role in helping people comply with FSMA and just kind of what their role is in the current food safety landscape. And yeah, just since many of you are inspectors of CCOF, feel free to hit me up with any questions or refer growers to me directly. Wholesalers, distributors, and buyers, they're increasingly requiring assurances that their suppliers are using good ag practices, good handling practices, or GMPs, good manufacturing practices. And Kaylee and Dave touched on some of these, but the assurances can come sometimes simply from the grower or the producer saying, look, I have a food safety plan, and the buyer will accept that. And that's great when that happens. Sometimes they'll ask to send over the food safety plan so the buyer can review it. Some buyers will go out to the farm and conduct their own audits, and we kind of consider these second-party audits. And then the way to get another set of eyes on the whole program is through having a third-party audit to any one of the various standards or schemes out there. Schemes are generally grouped into what people, I think, in the industry consider like GFSI and then non-GFSI benchmark standards. And some of the non-GFSI benchmark standards include the leafy greens marketing agreements, the USDA good agricultural practices and good handling practice audits. And then some of the GFSI benchmark standards include Primus, SQF, BRC, and Global Gap. So some of these third parties, they can be government agencies like state departments of ag or departments of public health. And then the other kind of major entities out there are independent certification bodies like CCOF, SDS Global, Cert ID. There's a bunch of CBs out there offering various services. And the CBs usually have to attain accreditation to administer the scheme. And buyers, I often joke that it's a buyer's world and we just live in it because they decide what standards they'll accept, and some buyers go so far as to only accept certificates from certain approved CBs. GFSI, it stands for Global Food Safety Initiative, and it's a global consortium made up of retailers, government agencies, academia, who all work to benchmark various private food safety standards that they kind of deem equivalent. And that's what equivalency and benchmarking are kind of synonymous. Most standards, both GFSI and non-GFSI, are undergoing efforts right now to harmonize with FSMA requirements. So the folks over at USDA are working on bringing their checklists in line with some of the FSMA requirements. Global Gap has some efforts. We have there's an addendum that goes on, and then there's the national interpretation guidelines. And I know that Primus is also working on rolling out a new version of their checklist to incorporate current business standards. So I think that's been pretty helpful. So yeah, compliance with food safety requirements is a very real challenge out there, but I feel like certified operations are well positioned to get that compliance. There's some additional risk assessments that people need to complete. There's templates out there for those. There's policies they need to document, procedures to write out that might be new, trainings, and then of course records. But I feel like certified organic producers they're used to audits, they're used to regulatory schemes and regulatory systems. And if they look at food safety as adding on these component systems to their already existing system, I feel like it's a more digestible compliance or certification to take on. That's kind of about it. I mean, I had more, but I feel like we could open it up to questions and just be here for as a resource for people.
Sounds good. So thank you, Jacob. If people have more questions about third-party audits or any additional questions for Kaylee and Dave, feel free to send them in. We did have one question come in that recognizes that they're going to talk a little bit more about worker health and hygiene and water in the upcoming webinars, but could you just kind of highlight a couple things in the worker health or hygiene areas that people might want to or are going to have to consider?
Sure. Well, the one main one that we mentioned already was that if you're a fully covered farm, you're going to need to have at least one person that's a responsible party or supervisor from the farm attend the PSA training, the grower training, which is held in different parts of the country. It's a full day-long training. You can find the upcoming lists of trainings if you Google PSA grower training, and then you go to the left sidebar and it has like upcoming grower training. It's listed there. And that's one main area where you have to go to that training if you are a fully covered farm. There's no other option at this point. And then there's also it's not just you going to the training from your farm, you then would need to make sure you go back to the farm and you train your employees on different topics on the farm so that they are only working when they don't have symptoms that they have a foodborne illness, and that they are trained to not harvest crops that have been contaminated, etc. And you need to document that.
So I'm doubtful that any real inspections are going to occur until the end of 2018. So I think people have all of 2018 to come into compliance. If they're a larger farm, and over $500,000 is not all that large. So yeah, so people have some time to take this PSA training and then train the workers and implement a variety of these kinds of things. We'll get around to the water testing. There has to be a baseline of a number of water tests created, and but you have a number of years in order to accomplish that.
Great, thank you. And then just to clarify that it's an actual employee of the company that needs to take that training, not a consultant.
Right, it needs to be somebody that has authority at the company or the business to make changes necessary if the farm's not in compliance currently. It can't just be somebody who shows up once a year. It needs to be somebody who's actively involved.
I think it could be. I think we had this discussion, and it could be a consultant if the consultant is there all the time and is readily available if an inspector came, that sort of thing, right? But it can't be somebody who's basically not there and not available in some way.
Great, thank you. So I think that's all the time we have for questions for today. Again, we're going to be hosting 2 more webinars in the future, so if we didn't get to your questions, there will be ample time for that, and we'll be sending out a lot of resources. So again, Kaylee, Dave, and Jacob, thank you for your presentations and for all the wonderful information on FSMA. Just a couple additional resources to add to Kaylee's page. The Family On-Farm Food Safety Project from Family Farms has a lot of great resources, and they have workshops. They work with partners across the U.S., so if you're not based in California and you're looking for resources, they're a good place to go. And the CCF website has lots of information. You can find out more about food safety services and organic certification. And if you want to find out about our upcoming webinars, check out our weekly newsletter. Upcoming events, as Kaylee mentioned, we'll have the additional webinars for ag professionals on FSMA. We also, in 2018, will be offering the FSMA required TSA food safety trainings for growers at various locations in California, so keep an eye out for that. And later this fall, we will have some non-food safety related trainings, one on cannabis regulations, as well as a webinar in Spanish on labeling and post-harvest handling for growers in Mexico. So thank you again for attending. We hope you found the information useful. Please fill out your evaluation forms. If you would like to receive CEA CEUs, please include your name and certification number in the evaluation that'll pop up on the screen. And thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.